Lulun, passing by Ezhou in the evening. The clouds open, and I see Hanyang's city far in the distance, still a day away for this little boat. The traders slept this morning, knowing the river would be smooth. The boatman in the night whispered as the tide freshened. Wandering these southern streams, my whiskers grew white as autumn. Under the moonlight, I think of home, 10,000 miles away. All I had, all I hoped for, was destroyed in the rebellion. Unbearable, the sound of war drums rolls again across the river. So we continue with mid-Tang poetry. Lulun is a poet we've encountered already. He has a total of 6 poems in this anthology, which puts him in the Bronze League, you could say. Still, he has 6, which is more than most of the poets in that category have. We talked about Lulun when we read his previous poem, which I think was a regulated pentasyllabic poem. This is a regulated heptasyllabic poem. He has another 4 poems on the same theme later on a genre I had never heard of before reading this anthology. I think in the regulated pentasyllabic Juefu, but we'll talk about that later. Those poems, though, do represent perhaps the genre for which he was best known, which was as a successor of Gao Shi and Sun Shen, in the subgenre of military frontier poetry, describing the exotic landscapes of Central Asia and the miseries of Chinese soldiers in the wars and the campaigns against the barbarians. Lulun is probably the most representative figure of the group known as the Dali era poets, of which we've talked a lot and of which we've encountered a few in previous poems. So Han Hong was one of them. And other close friends of Lulun were Qian Qi and Li Duan, whom we've already encountered as well. And we also mentioned that the Dali era poetry, they mainly became famous in the aftermath of the An Lushan rebellion, maybe in the 760s, 770s, and under Emperor Dead later on. And their style is generally not too appreciated today. They're believed to be like manneristic, able craftsmen in the shadow of the High Tang poets, but generally continuing with the topic, subject matter, forms of High Tang poetry. So Lulun, not much to say about him biographically. He occupied middle, lower level positions in the administration. He basically served, in different provinces and minor posts. And towards the end of his life, in 798, Emperor Dead had him brought to the capital so he could enjoy his poetry, and he had some sinecure post or rather in the central government. So what's this poem about? Lulun passing by Ezhou in the evening. So already from the title we can see that this is a traveling poem. It's the genre about, the subgenre is a traveler's lament. Traveling in classical Chinese poetry is almost always used for complaining. That is, even though traveling might have been a pleasurable experience for some of the scholar officials, the convention is that traveling is, always a situation of sadness and misery where one is uprooted from one's homeland, perhaps also uprooted from the capital and the life of the civil servants in high office. So there's always a sad, melancholy pessimism in most traveling poems, even if a description of a lovely landscape or of a historic landmark also generally creeps into these verses. So this poem in many ways reminds me one we read a few days ago, or a few weeks perhaps, Liu Changqing's En route from Xiakou to Parrot Island at night. And in fact the geography is pretty similar. So the poet is passing through Ezhou. Now Ezhou was a town not very far away from Hanyang, which is mentioned in this poem and is mentioned with another name, Hankou, in Liu Changqing's poem. So Hankou was an important city at the confluence of the Han and Jiangsu rivers. It had other towns nearby. In fact, today they form a common conurbation, which is Wuhan, of fame, or rather infamous reputation because of the coronavirus crisis. Ezhou was close to those towns, but not quite. In fact, if we are to trust Lulun's poems, there's a one-day distance in a little boat from Ezhou to Hanyang. So the boat is traveling through the southern rivers. He is probably going in the direction of Hanyang, and he's in a small boat, and he is having the sad, melancholy thoughts of a northerner, probably in the south, far from home, far from the capital, and suffering old age and the aftermath of the Anlushan rebellion. So the main topic: sadness of wandering in the south, growing old, the chaos, the consequences of the chaos of the Anlushan rebellion, which at the time of the composition of this poem, which would have been probably at least 20 years after the actual rebellion, they continue to reverberate. And as we saw in Wei Jingwu's poem to Li Dan, part of the warfare that took place later in the 780s under Emperor Dezong also happened in the south. The south was mostly spared the aftermath consequences, well, the main consequences, the main military campaigns of the Anlushan rebellion, and also the aftermath. But there was a big place in the south, the province of Huaishi, which was under the rule of autonomous military governors who, in the 780s, a bit earlier, rebelled against the empire. And there was a big military campaign that lasted quite a few years to subdue this rebel province in the south. Okay, then, let's proceed as usual by commenting the poem couplet by couplet. A bit difficult to start with because I think the first couplet has been merged into a single line in this poem. So first line, which would probably be the first couplet: the clouds open and I see Hanyang city far in the distance, still a day away for this little boat. So the poem opens rather theatrically. It's like a curtain of clouds is opened up, and the first couplet usually locates us geographically and chronologically, but here the metaphor, the visual metaphor that is used is particularly effective at this. So the poem opens with the clouds opening, and the verb open, like a curtain, and we can see a city. It's far away in the distance, so it's just beyond the grasp of Lulun. Perhaps it's the place he is heading towards, but it's still out of reach. Yeah, as he says in what is probably the second line. Still a day away for this little boat. There's still some time and distance to be covered. And Lulun is not traveling in like some sort of luxurious or big transportation. He's in a little boat. How little? I imagine that is subjective. Are there other people in the boat? I imagine there must be at least a couple of rowers or something. I can't imagine a scholar official rowing a boat painfully for a whole day. Okay, second couplet. And I think this is the second couplet because the parallelism is pretty evident. The traders slept this morning, knowing the river would be smooth. The boatman in the night whispered as the tide freshened. So the second couplet, the first one locates us. Okay, I'm in this little boat traveling towards Hanyang, but still a day's distance from there. The second couplet takes us back in time and probably slightly back in space. So the poet evokes two other groups of people who are also traveling up the river, traders and boatsmen, and they are connected with two different times of day. In fact, the traveler with morning and the boatman with night. But anyway, at the time of writing this poem, both events would probably be in the past of the poetic persona's memory. Anyway, both types of people seem to transmit that it's relatively safe and comfortable to travel the river at this time of year. So the travelers slept during the morning, the traders, sorry. Is Lulun traveling with traders? Maybe not. Maybe they were other boats traveling along with him, or maybe yes, maybe the boat is not that small and it has traders as well. But anyway, they spent the morning sleeping. They had no reason to worry because they had been assured that the river would be smooth at this time of year. And the boatmen, the ones who are really moving the boat onwards, They whispered as the tide freshened during the night. Probably, what did they whisper? Maybe they whispered, yeah, it seems like we're going to have a peaceful journey. Perhaps things related to the navigation. Perhaps this couplet is a bit disordered in that probably the second line and the action of the boatman whispering as the tide freshens is the cause of the previous line, which would be the consequence. That is the traders sleeping off. Yeah. In any way, Lulun seems to be awake, listening to the boatmen and then watching the tradesmen as they sleep. Okay, so the third couplet, as usual, the second part of the Liu Shi moves us to the more subjective point of view, whereas the first two couplets are generally more descriptive, impressionistic, and landscapey. So, how is Lulun feeling about traveling? We've had no inkling of it until now, and now he tells us. Wandering these southern streams, my whiskers grew white as autumn. Under the moonlight, I think of home, 10,000 miles away. We get no clear indication in the poem of the season unless the fact that the river is smooth might correspond to some seasonal event that for the native readers would have been obvious. The reference in this couplet to the whiskers of the poet growing white as autumn, there's an explicit reference to that season. White is the color associated with autumn in Chinese correlative thought, as well as metal, as well as coldness and other elements, or rising coldness rather. The west, different elements. The moonlight can belong to any season, but it's specially referred to in autumn. So either the poem is taking place in autumn or not, but the poet is introducing these autumn images indirectly, as it were, to evoke the melancholy feelings of autumn. And in fact, this couplet clearly explains that the feelings of Lulun are feelings of sadness. He's wandering the southern streams. He's probably been wandering through them for years, not as a wanderer, but probably serving in office in different southern postings. And he's grown old during this service, like his whiskers now are white. And under the moonlight, so wakefulness at night, he is still awake. We have no indication, so perhaps the poem is taking place at night. Well, the title says in the evening, so I don't know what the Chinese original would stand in for evening would be, but probably sunset has taken place or is about to take place. So I don't think it's night yet, but anyway. Under the moonlight, now maybe the sun has set and the moon has risen. The poet, at least now, is going to remain sleepless. So he thinks of home. So the poet is feeling sad. He's missing his home. He's feeling old. The conventional tropes, the conventional ideas about a scholar official far from his land and, feeling dejected and sad. Finally, the last couplet puts a more social and political tinge to this sadness. The sadness is not just a personal and subjective one at being far from home and at being old. It's also the sadness of a failed career and of the Anushan rebellion. And, this last couplet has a very intense Du Fu flavor, you could say, because this is Du Fu's specialty, lamenting personal and national misery in the aftermath of the rebellion. All I had, all I hoped for, was destroyed in the rebellion. Unbearable, the sound of war drums rolls again across the river. So the poem ends on a very poignant and dark note, you could say. While traveling in the south, the poet feels sad. He contemplates the failure of his dreams and he assures us, don't know how realistic or not, but anyway, he assures us that the rebellion broke off his dreams of success, of service in office in the capital, of, being a successful scholar official. And as an echo of these ominous thoughts, the echo of war drums. Why are war drums rolling again across the river? This ominous dark image might be associated, again, depending on the time of composition of this poem, to the rebellion in Huaishi, probably relatively close to this area. Or, it might just be an accident, like there is a military company near about Ezhou, and, only it's not evoking current warfare, that might be taking place at the moment the poem is composed, but it might evoke the shadow of the wars that have been taking place before, and that Lulun considers the cause of his relative ruin. So, altogether, not a bad poem. As I said, it has a little bit of a whiff of an air of Dufu, which makes sense. Remember that these poets, the Dali era poets, are believed to be manneristic and in quite a straight line of continuation with the High Tang. But not a bad poem. Yeah, melancholy and sadness in the south, with old age and the country's turmoils in the background.